Hello everyone. What we're going to discuss in this lecture is the concept of evolution. This is a fairly recent concept, if we think. We just grasped it in the last couple of centuries, ultimately. Moving from a concept where we believe that everything was static, all organisms, the earth was as it has been created with a fixed hierarchy, to now a concept where we know that all species ultimately are connected with each other, and they are connected with each other through a process of evolution, which is dictated by different mechanisms. So what we're going to discuss here in this lecture, first of all, we'll discuss what evolution is. What do we mean by evolution? This is a concept that has changed, again, even the last couple of centuries. And then we'll see how do we get to the current concept of evolution, so the evolution of the idea of evolution. And then we'll focus mostly on Darwin theory of evolution by natural selection. So, starting from what evolution is. Take a few seconds and think about how would you define evolution. You can pause the video. Now we go through that. Evolution overall, all it means is change. Is a gradual change, which can be applied to different things. In our case, obviously, we're talking about living organisms, and so we're talking about gradual changes of living organisms. And unfortunately, often it's always thought as a process that leads to improvement of a species. This is not true. Okay? It's something that you got to remove from your mind, is that the idea that evolution is a change that always leads to an improvement of a species. It's not true. Evolution, all it is the change, a gradual change of any species or population. It might even lead to the formation of new populations. But it doesn't mean that it's leading to something better than what was there before. It might be more adaptable, but not always. So all it is. Then when we talk about biological evolution, what we're talking about is that gradual change that applies to population over time. Now, these changes can be minimal, invisible, and in that case we talk about microevolution. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. So these are small changes in the frequencies of the alleles of subpopulation dictated by different events, but oftentimes they're not even visible. We are evolving. As a human species, we are evolving still now, but we don't really see it. Or sometimes it might lead to big changes, which can lead even to the formation of new species. In this case, we'll talk about macroevolution, and we'll talk about that too, the process of speciation. Then, all of these changes obviously must be genetic. They're not environmental changes that can bring to that. And again, they can be visible or invisible. And now, they're caused by multiple causes. Again, when I ask you to think about what evolution is, most of the time, and I'm sure most of you always think about just the concept of evolution by natural selection, which is the starting concept of evolution that Darwin proposed. But it's not the only mechanism. There are many other mechanisms that actually lead to gradual changes of a population and therefore evolution. Okay, so there are many mechanisms, and not all of them lead to an improvement or an increased adaptability of a species to the environment, as natural selection does by itself. So evolution is nothing else than gradual change of a population. See, ultimately is the gradual change of the genetic of a population. Might be visible or invisible, might be small change, microevolution, a big change, macroevolution. But overall, it's just a change dictated by different causes. Natural selection is one of them, but there are other things like genetic drifts and other mechanisms that act and change the genetic of a population. So how do we get there? So let's talk about the evolution of the concept of evolution. Well, stepping back, what we gotta say is, until basically a couple of centuries ago, the church had a big influence, okay, even in science. It was basically creating a very static environment, even in science, even though there were more and more people thinking differently than what the church wanted. And the concept of evolution was not acceptable. And the reason being that the belief was that everything was static. This is a belief that was introduced originally by Aristotle, this Greek philosopher, that basically had classified everything present on Earth and above Earth into a fixed hierarchy, okay, where you were going from the smallest complex or the simplest complexes like minerals, moving up in a hierarchy of plants, animals, men, and then there will be basically the heavens, all right, where there will be demons, angels, and gods up there. And then this hierarchy was later on inherited and transformed by Christian theology, particularly, and coming out with this natural theology, but it still was making the same assumption that everything on earth was fixed, had been created by God, first of all. In this case, will be a superior being, a single God, and therefore being created by a superior being must have been perfect. If it is perfect, should not change, and therefore should not evolve. So the idea was that everything had been created by God perfectly, and nothing had changed. Okay, the fact that it was actually the church was dictating ultimately the description of all living organisms was also very static in terms of evolution of the Earth itself, the geography of Earth, and even dictating the timing. The timing was dictated by the Bible. The Earth would have been about 6,000 years old based on the Bible itself. So this was there before Darwin. Then obviously people think, beside what the churches say. I'm actually a believer, so, but people think. I'm still a thinker. And people were noticing that there were more and more discrepancies between what the church somehow was imposing as a belief and what was observable. Particularly, there were different disciplines, biogeography, geology, and comparative morphology, that were showing differences between what was there and what the church was saying. All right. So going one at a time. So biogeography is the science, first of all, that studies the distribution of species, living organism in different areas on Earth, in different geographical locations. So you can see there are marsupials present in Oceania, but not in Africa, and so on, stuff like that. Okay, so that's biogeography. And so what biogeographists were noticing is that they kept discovering more and more and more species, new species that had not been described before. Not only that, but they were finding also these species sometimes are present only in some locations on Earth and not in others. So already all of this was actually raising several questions, particularly these two questions you see here at the bottom. First of all, is there any limit? You know, the church would talk about a fixed number of species, but it looks like there are more and more species always coming out. So it's raising already the idea that, hold on, it's not fixed, the concept of number of species. There might be more and more being created over time. The other thing is that if all of these species are perfect, how come they are found only in some areas? How cannot be found somewhere else? How are they specific? Is there a connection ultimately between the environment and the species that can live in there, which we already introduced the fact that this species might not be perfect to live elsewhere. So it challenged the concept of perfection dictated by the church. Other evidence were the one coming from geology that was showing more and more that the Earth itself had signs of having changed over time. So what do we mean by that? Well, there were different scientists, particularly Cuvier is one of them, that he studied the area around Paris, large area, around Paris there, the geological area there. And what he was saying is that if you actually excavate that area, you see different layers there that have very different geological properties. They're not all the same. Okay. Not only that, but in these layers you can actually find fossils of different living organisms. Living organisms that are different from layers to layers. Not only that, the other thing is that in between these layers, oftentimes, there are actually layers where there are no living organisms. So putting all together, Cuvier, in the 1700s, there, came out with this theory, which is called the catastrophism theory. Basically, what he was saying is that in reality, Earth is not a static environment. It's a place that is subject to different catastrophes. Catastrophe that change, first of all, the landscape, hence the different layers that you observe, but also from time to time they can wipe out the species they are living in that environment, creating a gap and therefore leading to the formation of new species over time, or the invasion of new species in that place. That's something that I add myself. So introduce the concept that things are not static, both from a geological point of view and also from a biological point of view. Species can actually change over time. Another contribution in terms of geology to challenging the theological idea of a static world came from Charles Lyell between 1700s and 1800s, or in the 1800s I should say, that indeed, as Cuvier has say, he challenges the idea that the geography is always static. And so what he's saying is that, sorry, I'm moving on the wrong slide here, that indeed the Earth is changed. He's observing the same thing and is explaining, even trying to explain the mechanism behind it. There are eruptions, there are glaciers that move, that change. And so the important contribution by this scientist is that, together with contribution as well, is that it actually changes the timing. Start challenging the biblical timing. The biblical timing says that the Earth is about 6,000 years old. But based on his observations, say no, it would take much longer than that. So he's talking about millions of years. Now we know it's billions. But again, besides getting wrong, the scale is still changing, is still challenging the biblical view of the geology, of the description of the Earth, by saying Earth is changing, first of all, and it took much longer than what the Bible says. There is something wrong about the timing of the Bible. Third, science that challenges again the biblical view, the theological view of the of Earth, is comparative morphology. This is a science that studies basically the structure found in different organisms and compares them to each other. And so what they were looking at the structure, for example, of limbs, structure of skulls, structure of different body parts. And there were some body parts that theoretically they should have been made by God in a perfect way to suit a specific environment. Here is an example. These are the structures, okay, the skeleton of the limbs found in animals that they are adapted to walking, that's pigs, animals that are adapted to swim, and animals that are adapted to fly. Now, if you think, if these are made by God directly, okay, as is, I'm not questioning whether they're made by God in different mechanisms, but if they're made directly by God, right, as the Bible says, just took 7 days and it's done, and you believe that these structures have been made exactly for what they were supposed to do, then you would expect, as an engineer, as guys should have been, as an engineer, you will make this structure the best possible for that environment. So they should be different from each other, right? You're not going to use wings like an airplane to walk on land, right? To move on land. You would use wheels on land, and you have these big wings to fly. Or you have different mechanism, underwater propeller, underwater to move. Instead, if you compare them, they're actually basically very similar. If you compare the bones that you find in this structure, very similar. They look like the same structure, just with some changes. Are they indeed coming from the same structure? So these evidence from comparative morphology applying to other structures as well are challenging the fact that these are structures made perfectly for a specific function. Instead, they could be arising from a unique structure, the same structure that then has evolved to adapt to the specific environment, implying changes, not a static view of living organisms. So all of these evidence put together, they start challenging more and more again the theological view of Earth and living organisms. And so scientists start coming out with the idea how organisms could actually start accepting, first of all, that organism can change, the The environment can change, but how can it change? They start thinking, how does it work? How do organisms come to be what they are by changing? So through evolution, so introduce the concept of evolution. The first concept of evolution was introduced by Lamarck in the 1700s, where he was acknowledging that indeed organisms change, and he was suggesting two mechanisms. We know they're wrong. Okay, so there are two mechanisms behind the theory of evolution by Lamarck. The first one is what's called the principle of use and deuse. It's basically saying that body parts in an individual within a population change based on how much they're used. It makes sense. Start working out, you will see that your muscle grow, right? Works in some cases, but not in some cases. So, but that's an observation. So the use and disuse of some body parts cause them to change, either grow or become vestigial, or lose, right? Get lost. Second principle behind this theory of evolution is the principle of inheritance acquired characteristics. So what it says is that now, once you change your structure as an individual, then you're able actually to bring it to your offspring. You can lead to that. So basically, this cartoon here is very funny, but it shows how Lamarck would think about how giraffes have evolved. So you would have a bunch of giraffes here that unfortunately they cannot reach the leaves on top of a tree, and therefore throughout their life they extend their neck more and more. They push, and so they get longer, and then their babies acquire this, what they have achieved in their previous generation. So it's passed from this generation to another one. We know that this theory is clearly wrong, right? We know that. It's obvious. So that's an example you can see here. So then if Lamarck's theory was right, now you know if you work out, then you should have babies that come out already built up, right? To having the same characteristic. We know this is not true. However, Lamarck gave a great contribution. His idea was still groundbreaking in some way, because he was adding four key components to the theory that theology is wrong. First of all, he was introducing the concept that species were changing. It was stated for the first time, species are changing over time. They're not static. Now it was the first person to make the connection between the changes in species and the environment. So the environment has an effect on the species. Now, he also introduced the fact that there are mechanisms behind changes, not a random change. There is something driving there, the changes. He got it wrong, but still, there are some mechanisms changing that. The last thing, he also made these changes genetics. So he was the first person that introduced the fact that these changes, which are introduced by the environment somehow through some mechanism, now they can be passed from one generation to the other one. His big mistake was actually that he focused on specific individuals, but you will see later on when we talk about Darwin. And indeed, here we are. We talk about Charles Darwin. Finally, in the 1800s, this scientist is not the only scientist, is the first person that actually came out with a theory of evolution which is still accepted with major variances. Okay, we still think of him as the only way of his mechanism by natural selection as the only way of driving. No, it's not correct. But he's the first person that finally explained in a scientific way how two things: how all living organisms have evolved from a common ancestor. This is actually his own drawing. Okay, how they would all have evolved from a common ancestor. Not only that, and we know that's the LUCA, the last universal common ancestor that we talked about in the first bio. Not only that, but also he came out with a mechanism that would have led all the species existent on Earth nowadays to have evolved that way through a process which is referred to as natural selection. This is what he published in this book called The Origin of the Species, where he explains how all species again are connected, they all arise from the same common ancestors, and this is driven by natural selection. We'll talk about that in a second. One thing I want to stress on is that Darwin is credited by the idea, but in reality, this idea, there is another scientist, Alfred Wallace, that came out at the same time with the same idea. And in fact, Wallace and Darwin were talking to each other. all the time. They exchange ideas. In fact, Darwin collected so much information. He had this idea in his mind, but was not publishing it. He spent years before actually publishing because there were a lot of doubts regarding what was the mechanism behind. There was no knowledge of genetics at that time. So, and it was the communication with Wallace that indeed pushed him to publish it, because Wallace came out with exactly same concept, exactly the same idea. They were communicated, and indeed, before even Darwin published The Origin of Species, they actually published a paper together with exactly the same theory of living organisms being all connected with each other through the process of evolution from a common ancestors. This is not the paper I'm showing there. And then Wallace published other papers as well, but he has as much credit, he deserves as much credit as Darwin with the theory of evolution by natural selection. The reason that Darwin became so popular is because right after they published the paper together, he came out with that book where, again, it summarized the same theory that they came out with together, but with a lot of supporting evidence. So let's see how Darwin got to his theory shared by Wallace. Well, the way he got there, you probably know, is by collecting a lot of samples. So he traveled indeed for 5 years around the world. I cry every time I say that. And the reason being that I wish I could do the same thing. Take a boat and travel around the world. So he traveled around the world. In reality, he was on the boat for about 2 years, and then on land in different places for more than 3 years. But altogether, he traveled for 5 years. And during this time, actually, he was not even what we would call now the principal investigator. He was actually traveled to help the captain of the boat collecting sample. Still, by doing that, when he was traveling, he collected tons of samples. Everywhere he was gone, he was taking sample, doing drawings, so taking observation. That's why important for you to keep your lab book very well. Observation, collect samples, whatever you get, write it down. So he collected that for 5 years. And then he tried to piece all of these things together. And so while he was collecting this, he was observing a lot of similarities between different fossils and living organisms, and also a lot of differences. But for example, he was observing that the similarities between an extinct organism like Glyptodon and Armidodon. This is still existing organism, right? And so his question was, hold on, why don't they live at the same time? How come this doesn't exist anymore? And how come they're similar? So this introduced the idea of, first of all, species are not perfect if they disappear over time, right? There must be something driving their extinction. Second thing, is there a connection between them since they're very similar? Is it possible that this organism has evolved from the Glyptodon? First thing. Also, he was also observing differences between very similar animals. Animals that before maybe could have been considered the same animal, but now it's saying, hold on, even species that are basically very similar to each other, they have some slight differences. And the other big thing is that he not only recorded observation and collected samples, but also he wrote down observation about the distribution of these different organisms. So he took a lot of information in terms of biogeography of this living organism. What is present in their environment where they live? So is there a connection between the properties of these animals and the environment? So based on all the observation that Darwin took, he came out with this theory that basically unifies all the living organisms from an evolutionary point of view, stating that basically all the living organisms that have lived or are living right now, so they ever lived, they all descended, or they all were originated through a process called descent with modification. That's how he called it. That basically what it implies is that all living organisms would have originated from a common ancestor a long time ago. And all the species that we observe now or have been observed as fossils, they have been originated through what is called evolutionary divergence, where you have that one species give origin to two species, which then can split further, and therefore giving all origin to all the variation that is observed right now. So Darwin not only came out with this unifying theory of the descent with modification, the origin of all organism by descent with modification. But also he explains what are the mechanisms behind the evolutionary divergence. What is leading one species to form another species, to change and eventually form another species and other species and so on. And we know that mechanism they came out with is what is called natural selection, which I want to stress is only one of the many mechanisms. That's the only one that Darwin understood at the time. But what does it consist of? And how did he get to the concept of natural selection? Well, it came through different observations. The first one is that he was very accustomed to a very similar process, which is referred to as artificial selection, which was very commonly done in UK, particularly when he was alive. That's where he's from, where different breeders were producing different type of animals that could fit their own interests. For example, with dogs, look at the dogs nowadays, they're all artificial. Okay, they're all human made. There's not a wild dog. And all of these dogs were indeed originated through breeding, artificial selections, to generate dogs that could have a specific function helpful for human. For example, you can have a dog like the terriers, they're great at chasing rats. You can have dogs that are great, like um, sheep dogs, that they're great at herding animals, so moving them around. So all were produced by artificial selection. So Darwin came out with the idea, well, if it's possible for humans to do that, isn't it possible that nature can do a similar process, obviously not for human interest, but basically selecting organisms that can adapt better to the environment they are in, right? The ever-changing environment could put some sort of pressure, and therefore nature, through this environment, is selected for individuals that have what we call adaptive traits that can fit better in this environment, and this will cause them to change and eventually form different species. This is not the only reason why Darwin came up with the process of natural selection. He was also very well aware, based on his own observations, but also observations done by other people, like economists too. I had observed that indeed on Earth there are limited resources. And it's very evident if you look, for example, at species as Darwin did. You can see many species produce so many offsprings, so many, that based on the production that they have in terms of offsprings, they should be taking over the world very quickly. But no species does that. The growth is not proportional to the number of offsprings that you see. Not only that, you observe also that within populations there are indeed big variation. Not all populations for a specific species are made by individuals identical to each other. There are variations. What is the point of those variations? Not only observe that there are variations, but also you observe that some of these variations are passed to offsprings. So that must have some sort of genetic base. He didn't know about genes, but by definition, if they're passed, they must be genetic. And not only that, but some of this variation also clearly can give one member of a population an advantage versus the other in terms of survival and also reproductively advantage. So that was part of his observation. So this summarizes basically the observation that he did and how he came out with the idea of evolution by natural selection. So the main observation was that indeed there are variation among, no species really take over, no population or species take over the world, even though they can be producing a lot of offsprings, but they don't grow indefinitely, and there is a limited amount of resources. So no species is taking over the world. So something is somehow limiting the growth of a population. And what is that? Well, he observes a lot of variation, right? And some of these variations are genetics that can be passed from one generation to another one within the population, and some of them can actually give an advantage in terms of survival and capacity to reproduce. So if you combine the two things together, you can see how you have limited resources, which basically force some individual between a population with some characteristics to basically be enriched in that population because they can fit better, they have better access to that limited resources. As a result, populations will change with the individual with the advantageous trait or adaptive trait becoming more and more abundant within that population. And that's the idea of evolution. That population is evolving into a different group of population there. So he came out with the theory of natural selection. Again, summarizing what this means. What it means is that natural selection here favors inheritable, so genetic adaptive traits, traits that can be passed from one generation to another one. Traits that are adaptive because they make the individual that carry them, first of all, more likely to survive, they're better fit, and also to reproduce. So that's important, that they have to be able to reproduce to give them a reproductive advantage. Otherwise, it would just last for one generation, would not be passed to the next generation. So, as a result, since this individual with this specific trait, adaptive trait, have a higher chance of surviving and reproducing, now they will become more frequent within that population. So those traits will become more frequent. And so, as a result, natural selection would have changed the population, enriching with that specific traits. This is very different from what Lamarck had said. This cartoon here shows you what would happen to this population of giraffes, for example, if the mechanism of Lamarck was actually correct. Based on the theory or the principle of use and disuse, what you would have in this case is that even this giraffe, which is not fit originally, just by using the neck, extending the neck, trying to reach these leaves, overall should probably grow and then being able to pass the next generation and so on. So evolution will be acting on the individual within the population. What Darwin is saying now is that instead, in this population that has this variation, so there are giraffes with long necks and short necks, some of these traits give an advantage to these giraffes, give them a survival advantage, right? They can eat more easily compared to the short ones, the one with a short neck. Not only that, but as a consequence, we give them also a reproductive advantage. What it means that in the long run, those giraffes that don't have the adaptive trait will be selected out. Most likely they would die. And therefore the population would get enriched, would change and be enriched in giraffes with that trait that makes them more adaptable to the environment. So, and if the environment stays the same, this change will be carried over from one generation to another one and so on. So that's the principle of natural selection. Here, let's look at a more realistic example than the cartoon. That's what he observed looking at the finches in the Galapagos. He observed in other species as well. Turtles as well in the Galapagos are different from one island to another one. But if we look at the finches in the Galapagos, you see that these birds, they're very similar, but they have different bills, and depending on the island you go and look for them. So if you go in islands like this, where there are cacti, they tend to have a smaller bill than, for example, if you go in an island like this one, where there are large seeds, where they have a large bill, and so on. So here, where there is a lot of insect, instead, they have a longer and narrow type of bill. So how can you explain this in terms of evolutionary natural selection here? Well, how it could be explained, and that's how Darwin explained that, is that they all in reality descended from the same species, the same type of finch. Indeed, the finch that you find in the mainland in South America would have actually a large bill like this one, the seed eater. So these would have been the finch that had migrated to these islands. But now, depending on where the finch ended up, and so depending on the environment, depending on the food that was found in the environment, there would have been different natural selective pressure, which would have favored different type of finches within the same population. So if they landed on the island with lots of large seed, the pressure would have favored, so there would have been several types of finches probably coming out. This variation on the bill would have been there. I would have selected for those with a large bill. Whereas if they had ended up in an island where there is a lot of insects but very little large seed, now this variation that would have come out from the original one would have been selected, naturally selected, to become more and more abundant. And therefore now, to a point that basically they would have formed a species very different from the original one and different from the one that you can find in different islands. So the adaptive trait here would have been the size of the bill, right? And the pressure would have been put by natural selections on the most adaptable bill for the specific type of food found in the island. And so this would have been, again, give a survival advantage to the finches with a specific bill adaptable for the food found in the island, right? And not only that, but because they could feed more, they would have had also a reproductive advantage, and therefore the population that first landed in any of these islands here would have changed with time, right, towards the population that you see now with a specific type of bill. So what were the novelties in all of these that Darwin proposed? So first of all, he proposed a unifying theory which is based on physical evidence. There is no theory anymore. It's not theoretical in this case. All of this is based on his observation, what he has seen, all the fossils he collected, all the observations about the environment and the drawings of the animals that he saw. So there is no more theory, no more theology. This is based on physical evidence. Now, other big change, for example, compared to the theory that Lamarck was proposing, is that now selection is working on groups of organisms. It's not working on the individual anymore. It's working on a group of organisms that have different variations, right? So working through several steps, selecting those that have a specific variation caused by mutation. We can say now we know that it's caused by mutations in genes that makes them more adaptable to the environment, right? And so natural selection is causing the removal of those mutations that do not give this advantage over time. And so since this gives an advantage in terms of survival and reproduction, these cause the formation of a new generation which gets more and more enriched with the mutation. So the variation, the trait, the adaptive trait, that gives them the survival advantage. Now, this is a theory that now we all accept, okay, as an explanation of the evolution of all species. However, in those days, since exactly Darwin was talking about genetic variations without knowing what they were, they didn't know about genes, they didn't know anything about that. He was talking about something that was not really understood at that time. Even his theory was not understood, and it was not understood until Morgan started doing the study where he was actually giving evidence of the existence in chromosomes of different genes, areas in this chromosome that would actually be correlated with specific traits, so the existence of genes. So until then, it was not really accepted. And then over time, this theory has been changed more and more, so has been enriched, if you want, with other findings, until in the 30s and the 40s, a group of scientists came out with what is called the modern synthesis, which is basically combining Darwin's theory of evolution with the Mendelian genetics findings. And is doing that by putting together other evidence supporting, other than the fossils, the morphological evidence and so on, is putting together other data. So this modern synthesis is changing over time. It's getting more and more rich. By bringing in data based on genetics, now we can sequence the DNA. We can further down this evolutionary tree that Darwin had proposed, and then brought in information about biogeography, comparative morphology and embryology, so how different organisms evolve before they're actually born, paleontological findings, and so on. And so now evolution has changed. The definition of evolution has been changed to a change in a population dictated by the change in allele frequency, basically, in that population. That's the generic definition that now it's commonly accepted based on the modern synthesis. And obviously this explains the genetic base of evolution, which was not understood yet by Darwin yet, and has introduced also different mechanism of evolution which Darwin could not understand at that time. And that's what I was telling you at the beginning. Evolution doesn't happen only by natural selection, but there are other factors, other mechanisms which we'll talk about in the next few lectures, which are, for example, the gene flow. So you can have some people move into a certain place and bring in a certain frequency of alleles that will change the population. Genetic drift, there are other factors that can cause evolution other than natural selection. So in summary here, what did we discuss in this lecture? Well, we first defined what evolution is. Okay. Then we went through a quick overview of how did we get to Darwin's discovery. So how did we get to the common concept of evolution that is accepted now? So we went through first defining by different scientists, then particularly by Lamarck, which proposed, that was the first one to propose an idea that organisms were actually evolving. They were not made as a fixed hierarchy, as the church was saying, or Aristotle was saying. And so he came out with the principle of use and disuse and the principle of inheritance. And then we talked about Darwin, and I gave credit to Wallace as well for the same thing. Darwin's theory of the common origin of all species, so how they are all coming from the single original organism through progressive splitting of the different species. And then we talk about the concept, the mechanism that cause all these species to come into place, which is the mechanism of natural selections, which is caused by limited resources and the presence of genetic variability within population, with some of this variability making some individual more adaptable to the environment, particularly when the environment changes. So we talked about adaptive traits, how they lead to the survival and the reproductive advantage of some individual, and ultimately a change in the population, which is what evolution is. And finally, we capped it up by talking in one slide about how this theory by Darwin has evolved into what we call the modern synthesis that integrates basically the genetic findings, particularly to the theory of Darwin.